Okay. My name is Bernard Levine. I am a long-term member of ASPO, of which I'm proud. And today it's a special privilege to interview on behalf of ASPO, Carolyn Aldigé, who is the winner of this year's Joseph Cullen Award. And I've known Bo for a long time and have long admired her work in cancer prevention. Today, the nomination for the Cullen Award, which we're going to talk about, was by both Dr. James Molshine of Rush University in Chicago and myself. And we were both very honored to be the nominees or co-sponsors of this nomination. So Bo, I thought most people know you well, but I thought just for a moment, won't you reflect back on why and how you started the Prevent Cancer Foundation?
Well, I'd be happy to do that, Bernard. And yes, we do go back a long way. I think I first visited MD Anderson in the mid 90s, and you hosted me for a visit. That was my first visit there. I remember John Mendelsohn giving his 1 year inaugural address. So whatever that year was when he had been at MD Anderson for a year, that was his 1 year anniversary. So it's been a while, but so I lost my father to cancer in 1984. He died on August 1st, which happened to be my mother's 65th birthday, and my father was 66. And he died of a smoking related cancer. He had started smoking when he was about 13. I grew up believe it or not, in Reidsville, North Carolina, the home of Lucky Strikes. So you would drive into town and you'd see a big sign that says, "Quiet, please, tobacco asleep." So ironic that I would wind up doing what I'm doing. But I took care of my father while he was losing his life to this smoking related cancer. And it certainly got my attention. So it kind of propelled me to want to do something. And my husband actually goaded me into it. I said, "Well, what can I do?" And he said, "Well, you could start a foundation." And I said, "Oh, right." But he convinced me that I should try it. So I just sat down at the kitchen table and rolled up my sleeves and tried it and did this in memory of my father. And here we are, 35 years later.
And what a splendid record you've achieved. It's amazing. We can only talk today about a little bit of it, but thought that in terms of tobacco control and tobacco cessation, which are obviously the themes of the Cullen Award, let's discuss your role and that of the foundation. And perhaps let's take four areas which are very important to you. They are research, education, outreach, and advocacy. And perhaps you could touch on all of those in whatever order you like.
Of course. We sort of describe those as our four pillars. We say the foundation rests on those four pillars, and the activities, our programs, everything can be maybe not neatly, but at least tied to one of those four pillars. And since we started with research, I think I'll start with research. The first thing we ever did was to fund a research grant early in 1986. And that was not a tobacco-related research grant, but we did start funding tobacco control and tobacco cessation research very early on in the 80s. We have funded many young investigators who've gone on to become amazingly senior researchers. And I think of one of the proudest things I think we've done is funded sometimes a fellow who then went on to mentor another generation or two of fellows. And I can trace one of them. I think Dr. Jaz Ahluwalia, who's now at Brown University, was at Emory. We funded him as a fellow, and then he mentored a fellow who was doing tobacco cessation research, and that fellow in turn mentored another fellow. So it's a multi-generational thing, which I think is great. And one of the hallmarks of Dr. Ahluwalia and also his fellows of their research was looking at disparities in tobacco cessation and tobacco marketing to underserved populations. So that we have funded a number of other kinds of tobacco related research. I mean, to me, lung cancer screening is the product. It's what you need to do for somebody who has smoked for a long time. No matter what we do, the tobacco industry is still going to successfully market its products to the general public, and also targeted at specific populations. So it's really important to us to focus on the underserved. We have had a major emphasis on health equity. Our very first program that really lined up with the concept of health equity was funded in the late 80s, and it was a breast cancer early detection program focused on African American women. Nonetheless, we've been paying attention to underserved populations for more than 30 years. And we're really glad that health equity is now seeming to have a moment in the sun, and more organizations and more people are focusing on it and talking about it. And that's just so important. Our outreach work extends to funding community level grants, and many of these are mostly grants to organizations that are based in communities. They're grassroots type organizations, and they understand the populations they're serving and the communities they're serving. So we think it's just so important to deal with organizations that are already trusted by the people that they are meant to serve. So many of those community outreach grants have been for education and screening of underserved population, and education about tobacco cessation and tobacco control. We've done some interesting things lately, Bernard. We have we've sort of funded programs that are keeping up with the technology. So as far back, I looked it up, in 2007, we funded an internet-based intervention, which was kind of cutting edge at the time. Yes. And that was, I believe that was not one of Dr. Alawalia's fellows, but it was nonetheless we thought it was an important grant. And right now we have an active grant that's looking at a text messaging approach to tobacco cessation. And it's targeted specifically at Latinos who are also living with HIV. So it's a very specific population, but we've learned that you have to make your program specific to the people you're trying to serve. So I was interested recently to learn that about 90% of email in people's inboxes goes unopened, which I find amazing, because I either put it in my brown file or I open it. So I guess, I don't know whether people's inboxes are just loaded with a gazillion emails or whether they just immediately delete them. But a text message, something like 90, in the low 90s% of text messages get opened in the first 2 minutes. So these text messaging applications, I think, can be extremely, it seems to me it's a very successful approach. At least people are hearing you or reading you. Whether they act on it is another story. So we've had many educational programs, our third pillar, education. Obviously, tobacco, don't use it in any way, shape, or form, is at the top of every list of healthy behaviors that we promote. And so the educational programs that we do, we fund others to do in the community, as well as our own messaging is certainly focused on tobacco control. And then the fourth one, and then I'll be quiet, is advocacy. And we have been a loud voice in advocacy for tobacco control legislation. We're allowed voice for increasing budgets for the NCI, for the Division of Cancer Prevention and Control, for the CDC, and for all their efforts in tobacco control. But we've also been strongly in favor of efforts to give the FDA the authority to control tobacco, to control the amount of nicotine in tobacco, to control flavorings in tobacco, and in e-cigarettes, which are another whole story. But I think that the story of tobacco these days should include nicotine delivery devices that aren't necessarily combustible.
Yeah. Well, you've given a very modest overview of the impact you've had, but that's I think it's a good summary to give those who perhaps not familiar some flavor of the work that the Prevent Cancer Foundation has done. In one of our earlier discussions, you mentioned the American Non-Smokers' Rights Foundation and its impact. This is not something most people know about. I think it would be interesting to hear a brief summary of what that was and what it achieved.
That's right, we did. We discovered the American Non-Smokers' Rights Foundation in the late 80s, and we started funding them because we felt like their activities were so important. They were calling to public attention the fact that non-smokers had rights the same way smokers did. And smokers at that time could go in a restaurant and light a cigarette, and the people who didn't smoke had no rights to stop that behavior. So the American Non-Smokers' Rights Foundation was based in California, and they did an amazing amount of work to get smoking eliminated from public places, community by community. I mean, this was well before Mayor Bloomberg came on the scene and put tobacco control legislation into New York restaurants and bars. But I think they had a profound impact. And I read a study one time that was done, I think in the year, it was in the early 2000s, I believe. But the point is that when California was compared to the rest of the country, the rate of lung cancer was decreased by a factor of 4. So to me, that's a real testament to the effectiveness of these early tobacco control efforts on the part of nonprofits.
The foundation's had a lot of interest in promoting early lung cancer detection and prevention. In your opinion, what are the major challenges now that lie ahead? We've learned about the importance of CT scanning, and we have indeed results that show the importance of it, the value of it. But from your perspective, what needs to be done?
I think what needs to be done is to increase the uptake of CT screening for lung cancer, and for really as part of a scan of a thoracic CT scan. Because when we do a spiral CT to detect early lung cancer, that same CT scan can also detect early COPD and early cardiovascular disease. And these are the 3 leading cancer killers of Americans. So the challenge is in getting more people who are eligible for lung cancer screening to actually undergo lung cancer screening. And there's a lot of conversation about the harms of lung cancer screening, but it's our belief, and it's been validated scientifically, that the benefits far outweigh the harms. And in terms of a practical approach, I think there are a couple of things. One is that CMS still requires shared decision-making between a primary care provider and a person who's eligible for lung cancer screening because of their age and smoking history. And I think if that shared decision-making were eliminated, a lot more people, because it's an extra visit to the doctor. It's you've got to go and talk to your primary care provider and have a discussion about it. And you don't have a discussion with your primary care provider about mammography. He or she just gives you a prescription and you go get your mammogram. And I think the same thing should happen for lung cancer screening. And I also think another thing that could maybe propel it along is, and this was not my original idea. It came as a result of some conversations that have been had in an annual workshop we do on quantitative imaging. But it is to try to get a HEDIS measure for lung cancer screening. And people who are a lot smarter than I am believe that that would increase the uptake of this test.
It certainly made a difference when it came to colorectal cancer screening. That was an important step forward.
Yeah.
So you're right. I think that would be an important gain. We're getting to the end of our discussion, unfortunately, but I have one question more for you. How would you explain the importance of the field which you've pioneered to a young person who was considering getting into this area of research and advocacy and education?
I probably could sum it up in a nutshell, and that is you'll always have a job. There's no shortage of research that needs to be done, and particularly in the applications of research that has already been done. I think the whole field of electronic cigarettes and advocacy for eliminating flavored cigarettes and for educating young people about the dangers of e-cigarettes, because I think a lot of times they don't understand that it's a dangerous activity. Limiting the ability of the tobacco industry to market to young people, getting people to understand the value of getting a CT scan to detect early stages of the 3 leading killers of Americans. So, and then more basic research in behavior and what motivates people to change their behavior. And to me, that's the hardest thing there is that I've discovered in 35 years of doing this.
So it sounds like with appropriate funding, a young person could make a good career and make real contributions.
Absolutely.
That's what you said.
I think so.
Bo, as we conclude this, I want to actually read something that is derived from an ASCO Post interview that you did about 6 years ago, and I thought it was a good summary. It says, a last thought, one that puts the big picture into perspective from a dedicated globe-trotting humanitarian who's been battling at the front lines of cancer prevention for more than 3 decades. We have 2 little grandsons, and not a month has gone by that I've not spent time with them. These visits keep my daily frustrations in perspective. We have to make the world they grow up in a better place. And that includes keeping people from getting cancer or helping them detect it early when it can be successfully treated. Well, that's a lovely summary, I thought, of all the achievements that you've accomplished. And it's a wonderful tribute to you that the ASPO has awarded you the Cullen Award, which is just a part recognition of all that you've accomplished. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernard.
Thank you. That's with great admiration.
Oh, you're very kind.